February 1943. Stalingrad, Soviet Union. Gefreiter Hans Becker stood in a column of thousands of German prisoners being marched through the frozen ruins of the city his army had tried to capture. The temperature was minus 30 degrees Celsius. Becker wore only his tattered Wehrmacht uniform with no winter coat because Soviet captors had confiscated his greatcoat immediately after capture. His boots were falling apart. His hands were black with frostbite. He had not eaten in 3 days, except for a handful of frozen bread distributed once during the march. Around him, prisoners were collapsing from exhaustion, from cold, from starvation. Those who fell were left where they lay because the column kept moving and because nobody had strength to help anyone else. Soviet guards walked alongside the column with rifles, occasionally shooting prisoners who could not keep up or who tried to escape. Becker had been a soldier in the Sixth Army, one of approximately 91,000 German soldiers who surrendered at Stalingrad when the pocket finally collapsed. He had survived the battle, had survived the final weeks of starvation and cold in the encirclement, and had surrendered believing that captivity meant he would eventually be repatriated to Germany once the immediate chaos of the battle's end was resolved. He would learn that his captivity would last not weeks or months but years, that he would spend the next decade as forced laborer building Soviet infrastructure, and that hundreds of thousands of his fellow prisoners would never return home at all. The German invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941 began with rapid advances that captured millions of Soviet soldiers. German treatment of Soviet prisoners was catastrophic. Approximately 3.3 million Soviet prisoners died in German captivity from starvation, exposure, disease, and deliberate killing, representing one of the worst crimes of World War II. This horrific treatment created precedent and justification for harsh Soviet treatment of German prisoners when the tide of war reversed and Soviet forces began capturing Germans in large numbers. Soviet authorities viewed German prisoners as war criminals who had invaded Soviet territory, destroyed Soviet cities, and killed millions of Soviet civilians and soldiers. The prisoners were resources to be exploited for reconstruction and for extracting reparations through labor. International law regarding treatment of prisoners of war, codified in the Geneva Convention, required that prisoners be treated humanely, be provided adequate food and shelter, be allowed to communicate with families, and be repatriated promptly after hostilities ended. Soviet Union had not signed the Geneva Convention and did not consider itself bound by its provisions. Even if it had, Soviet authorities would likely have argued that German prisoners forfeited protections by participating in invasion and occupation that violated international law and that constituted crimes against humanity. The result was that German prisoners in Soviet custody faced conditions that were harsh, exploitative, and often deadly. The total number of German soldiers captured by Soviet forces during World War II is estimated at approximately 315 million. Additional prisoners included Austrians, ethnic Germans from other countries, and soldiers from Germany's allies, including Hungarians, Romanians, and Italians, who fought alongside Germans on the Eastern Front. The peak of German captivity in Soviet camps occurred in 1945–46, when over 2 million prisoners were held simultaneously. The mortality rate among these prisoners was catastrophic, especially in the early years. Estimates suggest that approximately 1 million German prisoners died in Soviet captivity, roughly one-third of all those captured. The highest mortality occurred in 1945–46, when hundreds of thousands died from starvation, disease, and exposure during the immediate post-war period, when Soviet infrastructure was devastated and when feeding and housing millions of prisoners exceeded Soviet logistical capabilities, even if Soviet authorities had been inclined to prioritize prisoner welfare, which they were not. Hans Becker's journey from Stalingrad to the labor camps that would become his home for the next decade began with the death march from the battlefield to transit camps. The march covered hundreds of kilometers through winter conditions without adequate food, water, shelter, or medical care. Prisoners walked 30 to 40 kilometers per day, sleeping in unheated barns or in the open, receiving perhaps 200–300 calories per day from bread and thin soup. The combination of cold, starvation, exhaustion, and pre-existing wounds or illnesses killed thousands during these marches. Bodies were left along roadsides or were buried in mass graves when columns stopped overnight. Survivors arrived at transit camps in desperate condition, emaciated, frostbitten, diseased, psychologically broken. The transit camps themselves were death traps. Thousands of prisoners were crowded into barracks or warehouses designed for hundreds. There was no heating despite winter temperatures. Sanitation was non-existent, creating conditions where dysentery, typhus, and other diseases spread rapidly. Food remained inadequate. Rations provided perhaps 500–800 calories per day, less than half what human body needs for survival at rest, and far less than what prisoners needed, given that many were required to work despite their condition. Medical care was minimal or absent. Wounded prisoners died from infections. Sick prisoners died from diseases that would have been treatable with basic medical intervention. The death rate in transit camps during winter 1943 and 1944 exceeded 10% per month in some locations, meaning that camps were losing over half their populations every 6 months. The camps were constantly being replenished with new prisoners from the front lines, creating continuous cycle of arrival, suffering, and death. Becker survived the transit camp through a combination of luck, youth, and willingness to do whatever was necessary to obtain extra food. He was 24 years old when captured, young enough that his body could withstand conditions that killed older prisoners. He learned quickly that survival required abandoning normal moral constraints, stealing food from weaker prisoners, volunteering for work details that provided extra rations, informing guards about prisoners who were planning to escape or who were hiding food, doing anything that might provide marginal advantage in calorie intake or in avoiding punishment. These survival strategies were morally compromising, but they worked. Becker gained enough strength to be classified as fit for labor, which paradoxically improved his survival chances because working prisoners received higher rations than non-working prisoners, even though the work was exhausting and dangerous. The Soviet decision to use German prisoners as forced labor for reconstruction and development was motivated by multiple factors. First, the Soviet Union faced enormous reconstruction needs. German invasion had destroyed thousands of towns and cities, had devastated industrial infrastructure, had disrupted agriculture, and had killed approximately 27 million Soviet citizens. Rebuilding required massive labor inputs at a time when Soviet labor force was depleted by war deaths and by demobilization of soldiers who were needed for agriculture and for civilian industry. German prisoners provided labor force that could be exploited without regard for worker welfare and without compensation. Second, using German prisoners as reparations in kind seemed just to Soviet authorities and to Soviet population who had suffered terribly during the war. Germans had destroyed Soviet infrastructure and had killed Soviet citizens. Making Germans rebuild what they had destroyed seemed appropriate both morally and practically. Third, keeping German prisoners in Soviet custody served security purposes by ensuring that experienced German soldiers could not be rearmed and could not threaten Soviet Union again. This concern was particularly acute given emerging Cold War tensions and given uncertainty about Germany's future political orientation. The projects that German prisoners worked on ranged from small-scale local reconstruction to massive infrastructure developments. In cities across the Soviet Union, Prisoners cleared rubble from destroyed buildings, repaired roads and bridges, rebuilt factories and housing, constructed new buildings according to Soviet plans. In rural areas, prisoners worked in agriculture, in forestry, in mining. Major infrastructure projects, including hydroelectric dams, canals, railways, and industrial complexes, utilized prisoner labor extensively. Some of the most significant projects included the Moscow metro expansion, where thousands of prisoners dug tunnels, built stations, and installed infrastructure for new metro lines. The work was dangerous, involving tunneling through unstable ground, working with explosives, and operating heavy machinery without adequate safety equipment. Many prisoners died in tunnel collapses, explosions, or accidents. The Volga-Don Canal, a major waterway connecting the Volga River and the Don River, was built largely with prisoner labor. Tens of thousands of prisoners worked on the canal, digging the channel, constructing locks, building support infrastructure. The work was brutally hard, involving moving millions of cubic meters of earth using mostly hand tools because mechanization was limited. Mortality among workers was high from accidents, from exhaustion, and from diseases. The reconstruction of Stalingrad, where prisoners who had tried to destroy the city were put to work rebuilding it. The symbolism was intentional. Germans were being forced to undo the destruction they had caused. Prisoners cleared rubble, rebuilt factories, constructed housing, and worked on every aspect of the city's reconstruction. The irony was bitter for prisoners who remembered fighting for every building in the city and who now were rebuilding those same buildings as prisoners. Numerous mining operations across the Soviet Union, particularly coal mines in Ukraine and in Siberia, used prisoner labor. Mining was among the most dangerous work prisoners performed. Cave-ins, gas explosions, and other accidents killed miners regularly. The physical demands of mining, combined with inadequate nutrition and with lack of safety equipment, meant that miners' life expectancy was measured in months rather than years. Many prisoners sent to mines never returned. Hans Becker was assigned to a construction brigade working on building housing in Kharkov, a major city in eastern Ukraine that had been largely destroyed during the war. His work involved carrying bricks, mixing mortar, assisting masons, and performing general labor on construction sites. The work was hard, but not as dangerous as mining or as tunnel construction. Becker's survival strategy was to work hard enough to avoid punishment, but not so hard that he exhausted himself, to volunteer for assignments that kept him visible to guards who controlled ration distribution, and to maintain enough strength that he could continue working and therefore continue receiving worker rations. The daily routine in labor camps followed predictable patterns. Prisoners woke before dawn, received morning rations of bread and tea, were counted and organized into work brigades, marched to work sites, worked for 10-12 hours with a brief break for midday meal of soup, marched back to camp, received evening rations, and were locked in barracks for the night. Variations occurred based on season, on specific work being performed, and on camp administration, but the basic pattern remained consistent. Discipline was maintained through a combination of carrots and sticks. Prisoners who worked hard and caused no problems received slightly better rations and slightly better treatment. Prisoners who worked slowly, caused problems, or violated camp rules faced punishment, ranging from reduced rations to solitary confinement, to beatings, to being shot. Escape attempts were rare, because escaping from camps deep in Soviet territory was nearly impossible. But attempts that occurred were punished severely, both to punish the escapee and to deter others from trying. The living conditions in the labor camps varied widely, depending on location, on time period, and on camp administration. Some camps had wooden barracks with heating stoves where prisoners could at least be warm during winter. Other camps had no proper housing, and prisoners lived in dugouts or in makeshift shelters that provided minimal protection from weather. Sanitation ranged from primitive latrines to complete absence of facilities, with predictable consequences for disease rates. Medical care ranged from camp hospitals, staffed by prisoner doctors using scrounged supplies, to complete absence of medical services beyond isolating sick prisoners to prevent disease spread. Food rations were supposed to be calibrated to work performed, with working prisoners receiving more than non-working prisoners, and with prisoners performing heavy labor receiving most. In practice, ration distribution was corrupt and arbitrary. Camp administrators and guards stole food meant for prisoners and sold it on black markets. Brigade leaders received extra rations as incentives for ensuring their brigades met production quotas, creating incentives for them to push prisoners harder. Prisoners who had valuables to trade or who provided services to guards received better rations than those who had nothing. The rations themselves were inadequate even when distributed as officially specified. Working prisoners were supposed to receive approximately 2,000 calories per day, but actual distribution often fell below this, and the food provided lacked essential nutrients. The typical diet consisted primarily of bread made from flour mixed with sawdust or other fillers, thin soup made from cabbage or other vegetables, occasionally small amounts of meat or fat. This diet provided enough calories for survival if work demands were not too high, but it did not provide enough for sustained heavy labor, and it lacked vitamins and proteins necessary for health. The result was widespread malnutrition, with prisoners developing deficiency diseases, including scurvy, pellagra, and beriberi, and with prisoners' immune systems compromised, making them vulnerable to infections. The diseases that killed prisoners in Soviet camps included dysentery, typhus, tuberculosis, pneumonia, and various other infections. Dysentery was endemic in camps with poor sanitation and killed thousands through dehydration. Typhus epidemics swept through camps periodically, killing large percentages of prisoners before burning out. Tuberculosis was a chronic problem exacerbated by crowding, malnutrition, and poor ventilation in barracks. Pneumonia killed weakened prisoners during winter. Treatment for these diseases was limited by lack of medicines, lack of trained medical personnel, and by Soviet policy that prioritized returning prisoners to work over providing extended medical care. Prisoners who became too sick to work were classified as invalids and received reduced rations, creating death spiral where sickness led to malnutrition, which led to worsening sickness, which led to death. The only salvation was recovering enough to return to work and regain full rations before starvation or disease proved fatal. The psychological impact of years in Soviet captivity was severe and lasting. Prisoners faced constant uncertainty about whether they would ever be released, constant hunger and cold and exhaustion, constant fear of punishment or death, constant isolation from families and from any news about the outside world. Letters from home were rare and heavily censored. Many prisoners received no mail for years and had no way to know whether their families were alive or what was happening in Germany. The psychological strategies prisoners used to survive included forming small support groups with other prisoners who shared resources and provided emotional support, maintaining daily routines that provided structure and purpose, focusing on specific goals like surviving until next season or until next holiday, and trying to maintain hope that release would eventually come. Some prisoners broke psychologically and gave up, ceasing to eat or work and dying within weeks. Others adapted to camp life and became institutionalized, losing ability to imagine life outside camps. A few maintained resistance through subtle sabotage or through maintaining dignity and moral standards despite circumstances. The interaction between German prisoners and Soviet civilian populations varied depending on location and circumstances. In some areas, Soviet civilians viewed German prisoners with hatred as invaders who had destroyed their homes and killed their families. In other areas, civilians showed sympathy to prisoners they encountered, occasionally providing food or clothing secretly despite prohibitions against such contact. Some Soviet women developed relationships with German prisoners, sometimes through genuine affection and sometimes through transactions where women exchanged food or protection for companionship or services. These relationships were officially forbidden, but occurred nonetheless, creating complicated dynamics in camps and in communities where prisoners worked alongside civilians. The children born from such relationships faced difficulties in Soviet society, where German ancestry was stigmatized. The question of Soviet motivations in retaining German prisoners for years after the war ended is complex and involved multiple factors. The labor value was significant. Prisoners provided essentially free labor that contributed meaningfully to Soviet reconstruction. The reparations value was psychological as much as material. Making Germans work to repair damage they had caused satisfied Soviet desire for justice. The political value lay in demonstrating Soviet power and in having leverage in negotiations with Western powers about Germany's future. The security value came from keeping experienced German soldiers unable to rearm. But extending captivity for years beyond any reasonable justification under international law reflected also vindictiveness, inefficiency, and callous disregard for prisoner welfare that characterized Soviet system generally. The turning point in German prisoners' fate came with Stalin's death in 1953 and with subsequent political changes in Soviet Union. The new Soviet leadership under Nikita Khrushchev sought to improve relations with West Germany and recognized that continuing to hold prisoners more than 8 years after the war ended was creating diplomatic problems. West German Chancellor Konrad Adenauer negotiated with Soviet authorities for prisoners' release. The negotiations were complex and involved linking prisoner releases to diplomatic recognition and to other political considerations. But gradually, through 1953-1956, most remaining prisoners were released and allowed to return to Germany. Hans Becker was released in 1955 after 12 years in Soviet captivity. He was 36 years old, had lost his entire youth, weighed less than 50 kilograms, suffered from chronic health problems resulting from malnutrition and from years of hard labor, and had no idea what had happened to his family or whether anyone was waiting for him in Germany. His return journey involved transit through East Germany, where Soviet and East German authorities attempted to recruit former prisoners to remain in East Germany and to serve communist regime. Becker refused and continued to West Germany, where he was processed through repatriation camps, was debriefed by West German authorities, and was eventually released to search for surviving family members. The return of German prisoners from Soviet Union was an enormously significant event in West Germany during the 1950s. Hundreds of thousands of families had relatives who had been captured by Soviets and who had not returned. For years, families had no information about whether their relatives were alive or dead. The gradual return of prisoners from 1953-1956 brought joy to families reunited with relatives thought dead, but also brought grief to families who learned definitively that relatives had died in captivity. The returning prisoners themselves faced difficult adjustments to civilian life after years of captivity. Many suffered from physical health problems that persisted for the rest of their lives. Many suffered from psychological trauma, including what would now be diagnosed as PTSD, depression, and anxiety. Many found that Germany they returned to was vastly different from Germany they had left, that family structures had been disrupted by war and by years of separation, that economic and social changes had made reintegration difficult, Becker's family situation was typical of the disruptions war had caused. His parents had died during the war, his father killed in bombing raid, and his mother dying from illness exacerbated by malnutrition and stress. His wife, whom he had married just before being deployed to Eastern Front in 1941, had remarried after being informed in 1947 that Becker was presumed dead. She had 2 children with her new husband and was unwilling to leave that relationship to reunite with Becker. Becker thus returned to a Germany where he had no family, no home, no job prospects, and no support system beyond government assistance provided to returning prisoners. His experience was replicated thousands of times as prisoners returned to find that their lives had been erased by years of absence, and that rebuilding was going to be as difficult as surviving captivity had been. The social position of returning prisoners in West German society was complex. Initially, returning prisoners were welcomed as heroes who had suffered for Germany. But as more prisoners returned and as their stories became known, public opinion became more ambivalent. Some Germans viewed returning prisoners as victims who deserved sympathy and support. Others viewed them as reminders of Germany's past that was better forgotten as Germany tried to move forward and rebuild as democratic society integrated with Western Europe. Returning prisoners themselves often felt alienated from a society that seemed to have moved on without them, and that seemed uncomfortable with their presence and with their stories. The economic integration of returning prisoners was managed through government programs that provided temporary housing, job training, and employment assistance. But the programs were overwhelmed by the scale of need, and many returning prisoners struggled for years to find stable employment and housing. Those who had lost years of their working lives faced particular difficulties because they had no work experience or work history that employers valued. They had no savings or assets, and they faced discrimination from employers who preferred to hire workers without the health problems and psychological issues that many returning prisoners exhibited. The political dimensions of German prisoners' treatment in Soviet Union became a contentious issue during the Cold War. West German government used the prisoners' suffering as evidence of Soviet cruelty and as justification for aligning with Western powers against Soviet Union. Soviet government defended its treatment of prisoners as justified by German crimes during the invasion and occupation of Soviet territory. The debate reflected broader Cold War propaganda battles where each side highlighted the other's failures while minimizing its own. The historical truth was that both German treatment of Soviet prisoners and Soviet treatment of German prisoners violated basic humanitarian principles, that both constituted crimes under international law, and that both reflected the total war mentality, where enemy soldiers were viewed as less than human, and where their suffering was viewed as acceptable or even desirable. The statistical accounting of German prisoners who died in Soviet captivity remains imperfect because Soviet records were incomplete and because German records of soldiers' fates were disrupted by war's chaos. Best estimates suggest that approximately 1 million of the 3.15 million German prisoners captured by Soviet forces died in captivity, representing mortality rate around 35%. This mortality rate, while horrific, was actually lower than the mortality rate of Soviet prisoners in German captivity, where approximately 58% died. The difference reflected partly the fact that Soviet system, while harsh, was not deliberately genocidal in the way that German treatment of Soviet prisoners had been, and reflected partly that Soviet Union retained German prisoners for years after the war, when conditions improved somewhat, while most Soviet prisoner deaths in German captivity occurred during the war, when deliberate starvation and killing policies were in effect. The geographic distribution of where German prisoners were held covered virtually the entire Soviet Union. Camps existed in western regions near the front lines where prisoners were initially captured. Transit camps in central Russia processed prisoners before distributing them to final destinations. Labor camps throughout Soviet Union held prisoners working on specific projects. The largest concentrations of prisoners were in the Urals and in Siberia, where major industrial developments required labor, but prisoners could be found in virtually any Soviet region where reconstruction or development was occurring. The conditions prisoners faced varied by region. Prisoners in southern camps faced heat and disease. Prisoners in northern camps faced cold and darkness. Prisoners in Siberia faced both extreme cold and isolation from any possibility of escape or communication with the outside world. The specific construction projects that utilized German prisoner labor left visible legacies across the former Soviet Union. Buildings, bridges, roads, railways, dams, and entire neighborhoods in many cities were built wholly or partly with German prisoner labor. In some cases, these contributions are acknowledged through plaques or memorials. In other cases, the prisoner labor is forgotten or deliberately obscured because acknowledging it would require confronting the exploitation and deaths that occurred. The cemeteries where German prisoners who died in captivity are buried range from maintained memorials to unmarked mass graves. Some burial sites have been identified and marked with grave markers listing the names of those buried there. Other sites remain unknown or have been lost to development or to neglect. Organizations, including the German War Graves Commission, have worked to locate and preserve burial sites, to identify remains where possible, and to provide families with information about where relatives died and where they are buried. But the scale of death and the inadequacy of records mean that many families never learned what happened to relatives who died in captivity or where they are buried. The testimonies of survivors collected through oral history projects, through memoirs, and through historical research provide detailed accounts of life in Soviet captivity and of the experiences that characterized those years. Survivors describe the constant hunger that dominated every thought and every decision. They describe the cold that penetrated clothing and made winter a fight for survival. They describe the exhaustion from performing hard labor on inadequate nutrition and inadequate rest. They describe the diseases that killed friends and comrades. They describe the psychological strategies they used to maintain hope and sanity. They describe the small kindnesses that prisoners showed each other and the small cruelties that desperation produced. They describe the moment when they learned they would be released and the complex emotions of joy, disbelief, and fear about what they would find when they returned. These testimonies preserve human dimension of a historical experience that statistics alone cannot capture. The comparison between the fate of German prisoners in Soviet captivity and the fate of German prisoners held by Western allies illustrates the different approaches the Allied powers took. American, British, and French forces captured approximately 7.6 million German soldiers. Most were held for relatively short periods before being released, typically within 1 to 2 years after the war ended. Conditions in Western prisoner camps were generally adequate, with sufficient food, decent housing, and medical care. Mortality rates were low, typically under 1%. The rapid release of prisoners reflected Western powers' interests in stabilizing Germany, reducing occupation costs, and moving toward normalization. The contrast with Soviet treatment reflected different geopolitical interests, different levels of war damage requiring reconstruction, different cultural and legal traditions regarding prisoner treatment, and different degrees of desire for revenge against Germany. The legal framework under which German prisoners were held by Soviets was questionable under international law. The Geneva Convention required that prisoners be repatriated promptly after hostilities ended. The war ended officially on May 8, 1945. Holding prisoners for years afterward solely for labor purposes violated this requirement. Soviet Union argued that state of war between Soviet Union and Germany continued technically until 1955, when peace treaty was signed, and that therefore obligation to repatriate prisoners promptly did not apply. This argument was legally dubious and was rejected by Western powers, but Soviet Union was not subject to any enforcement mechanism that could compel prisoner release. The situation illustrated the limitations of international law when powerful states chose to ignore it. The personal stories of individual prisoners provide human faces to the statistics. Werner Müller, captured at Stalingrad, worked in coal mines in Ukraine for 8 years before being released in 1951. He survived by volunteering for the most dangerous work, which earned extra rations that kept him alive when others starved. He returned to Germany permanently disabled by lung disease contracted in the mines and died in 1959 at age 42. Carl Schmidt, captured in 1944, worked on the Volga-Don Canal, where he witnessed thousands of prisoners die from exhaustion and disease. He survived by working as a medic in the camp hospital, where he could supplement his rations by trading medical services for food. He returned to Germany in 1954 and spent the rest of his life trying to document the deaths of prisoners who died alongside him, compiling lists of names and attempting to notify families about the fates of their relatives. Friedrich Wöber, captured in 1945, spent 10 years building housing in Moscow. He learned Russian, adapted to camp life, and became a brigade leader, which improved his rations and his treatment. He was offered opportunity to remain in Soviet Union as free worker after his release, but chose to return to Germany despite having no family waiting for him. Gustav Hoffmann, captured in 1943, attempted to escape from a labor camp in Siberia in 1946 and was recaptured and shot as an example to other prisoners. His family learned of his death only in 1992, when Soviet archives became accessible to researchers. These individual stories illustrate the range of experiences prisoners had and the various ways they attempted to survive or succumb to conditions they faced. The diplomatic efforts by West German government to secure prisoners' release intensified throughout the early 1950s. Chancellor Adenauer made prisoner repatriation a priority in his foreign policy and linked West German diplomatic recognition of Soviet Union to prisoner releases. The pressure worked partly because Soviet leadership after Stalin was more pragmatic and recognized that continuing to hold prisoners was creating problems that outweighed any benefits, and partly because changing Soviet policies toward Germany created openings for negotiations. The actual release process involved transporting prisoners from camps throughout Soviet Union to transit camps in Western Soviet Union and East Germany, processing them through administrative procedures and then allowing them to cross into West Germany. The process took months to complete for each batch of prisoners and extended over several years as different groups were released. Some prisoners, particularly those convicted of actual war crimes as opposed to simply being prisoners of war, were not released until 1955–56. The last prisoners returned in 1956, 11 years after the war ended. The memorialization of German prisoners suffering in Soviet captivity has been controversial in both Germany and Russia. In Germany, memorials honor the prisoners as victims of unjust treatment and commemorate the suffering they endured. Critics argue that such memorialization ignores or minimizes German responsibility for starting the war and for German atrocities, including the Holocaust and the treatment of Soviet prisoners. Defenders argue that recognizing German prisoners' suffering does not excuse German crimes, and that humanitarian principles require acknowledging suffering regardless of the victim's nationality or of their government's crimes. In Russia, discussion of German prisoners' treatment has been limited by reluctance to criticize Soviet actions and by sensitivity about seeming to equate German and Soviet suffering when Soviet Union lost 27 million people defending against German invasion. The debate reflects broader difficulties in how societies remember complex histories, where victims and perpetrators are not clearly distinguished, and where acknowledging one group's suffering seems to some people to diminish recognition of another group's suffering. The economic value of German prisoner labor to Soviet reconstruction is difficult to quantify precisely, but was certainly significant. Prisoners provided millions of hours of labor on projects throughout Soviet Union. The value of that labor, measured in terms of what it would have cost to hire free labor to perform the same work, was substantial. Whether the labor was actually economically efficient is questionable because forced labor is typically less productive than free labor because high mortality rates meant constant need to replace dead workers with new prisoners who required time to acclimate, and because the cost of guarding, feeding, and housing prisoners reduced the net economic benefit. But from Soviet perspective, prisoners were essentially free labor whose welfare was not a priority, making them economically useful regardless of whether forced labor was optimally efficient. The cultural impact of German prisoners' presence in Soviet cities and towns during the post-war years was significant. Soviet citizens, particularly in areas that had been occupied by Germany, harbored deep hatred for Germans because of atrocities committed during occupation. Seeing German prisoners working on reconstruction was satisfying to many Soviet citizens who viewed it as just punishment. But over time, as prisoners became familiar faces working alongside Soviet workers, some civilians developed more complex views, recognizing prisoners as individuals who were suffering, rather than as collective representation of German evil. Some Soviet citizens, particularly women who had lost husbands and male relatives in the war, developed relationships with German prisoners, creating family connections that persisted after prisoners returned to Germany. These personal relationships complicated official narratives about German-Soviet enmity. The Cold War context meant that German prisoners' treatment became propaganda tool for both sides. West used prisoners' suffering as evidence of Soviet barbarism and as justification for viewing Soviet Union as threat to civilization. East portrayed prisoners as having been treated humanely, and portrayed those who complained as fascists and war criminals who deserved their fate. The truth was more complex than either propaganda narrative acknowledged. Prisoners were treated harshly, but not uniformly. Conditions varied widely depending on time and place. Some prisoners adapted and survived reasonably well, while others died miserably. And Soviet motivations mixed legitimate need for labor and legitimate desire for justice with vindictiveness and disregard for humanitarian principles. The psychological research on returning prisoners of war has shown that extended captivity, particularly under harsh conditions, creates lasting psychological effects that persist decades after release. Studies of German prisoners who returned from Soviet Union found high rates of PTSD, depression, anxiety, and other mental health problems. Many survivors had nightmares about captivity for the rest of their lives. Many had difficulty forming close relationships because their trust had been destroyed by years in environments where survival sometimes required betraying others. Many felt guilt about having survived when so many comrades died. Many struggled with anger at having lost years of their lives and at having been abandoned by Germany during captivity. Treatment options were limited in 1950s Germany, where understanding of psychological trauma was rudimentary, and where stigma against mental health problems was strong. Many survivors suffered in silence rather than seeking help. The legal question of whether German prisoners could seek compensation for their treatment in Soviet captivity was addressed through various mechanisms over the decades. Some prisoners sued Soviet Union or later Russia for compensation, but such suits faced enormous legal obstacles including sovereign immunity and difficulties proving damages. Some prisoners received modest pensions from German government as disabled veterans or as victims of persecution. Some prisoners received no compensation at all, despite having suffered years of wrongful imprisonment and forced labor. The inadequacy of compensation reflected practical difficulties in calculating appropriate damages and in determining who should pay, but also reflected limited political will to press the issue because German government sought to maintain diplomatic relations with Soviet Union and later Russia, and did not want to make prisoner compensation a major dispute. The archival evidence about German prisoners in Soviet camps has become increasingly accessible since Soviet Union's collapse in 1991. Russian archives contain extensive records about camp administration, about prisoner deaths, about work projects utilizing prisoner labor. German archives contain records of prisoners' capture, repatriation, and post-war experiences. Combining these sources allows historians to reconstruct experiences of prisoners and to understand the systems that governed their captivity. But archives also have limitations. Official records often minimized problems and overstated achievements. Records of individual prisoners are often incomplete, and many camps kept inadequate records, particularly during chaotic early post-war period. The testimony of survivors remains essential for understanding what life was actually like in camps. The comparison between different categories of German prisoners illustrates that not all prisoners were treated equally. Officers generally received better treatment than enlisted soldiers because they were not required to work under Geneva Convention provisions and because they had higher status. Skilled workers, including doctors, engineers, and tradesmen, received better treatment because their skills were valuable and because keeping them healthy and capable served Soviet interests. Unskilled soldiers, particularly those captured in large numbers during encirclements, received worst treatment because they were viewed as disposable labor. Prisoners accused of specific crimes received harshest treatment, including torture, show trials, and execution or extended sentences. The differential treatment meant that survival odds varied significantly depending on prisoners' rank, skills, health, and circumstances of capture. The role of East German communist authorities in managing returning prisoners was controversial. East German government attempted to recruit returning prisoners to serve communist regime, offering immediate employment and housing to those who would agree to remain in East Germany and to support communism. Some prisoners accepted these offers because they had no alternatives or because they had been convinced during captivity that communism offered hope for Germany's future. Most prisoners refused and insisted on going to West Germany. Those who went to West Germany were viewed with suspicion by East German regime as class enemies and potential spies. Those who remained in East Germany were viewed with suspicion by regime as potentially unreliable because of their German nationalist backgrounds. Both groups found that their years in Soviet captivity continued to affect their lives through political persecution or through social stigma. The children and families of prisoners who died in Soviet captivity faced particular difficulties because for years they had no information about their relatives' fates. Many families spent decades wondering whether relatives were still alive somewhere in Soviet Union or whether they had died. The uncertainty was agonizing and made moving forward with their lives difficult. When confirmations of deaths finally came, usually through Red Cross notifications or through testimony from returning prisoners who had witnessed deaths, families experienced both grief and relief at finally knowing. But for many families, no confirmation ever came because records were inadequate or because no witnesses survived, leaving them with permanent uncertainty about what happened to their relatives. The physical structures built with German prisoner labor remain visible across the former Soviet Union today. Buildings, bridges, dams, and other infrastructure built in the 1940s and 1950s often utilized prisoner labor. In some cases, plaques or memorials acknowledge this history. In most cases, The prisoner labor is unacknowledged, and the structures are simply part of the urban or industrial landscape. The preservation of this history depends on efforts by historians, by human rights organizations, and by governments to document and to memorialize the contributions and suffering of prisoners who built these structures. The efforts face obstacles including lack of resources, lack of political will, and difficulty accessing sites that are now in different countries or that are in restricted areas. The moral lessons from German prisoners' treatment in Soviet captivity include recognition that even victims can become victimizers, that suffering does not justify inflicting suffering on others, that international law and humanitarian principles matter even when dealing with enemies who have committed terrible crimes, and that societies must find ways to acknowledge past wrongs even when doing so is uncomfortable or politically difficult. The German prisoner's story also illustrates how individuals caught in historical forces beyond their control respond to impossible circumstances, how some maintain humanity and dignity while others compromise morally to survive, and how societies remember or forget inconvenient truths about their pasts. Hans Becker lived until 1987, dying at age 68 in Hamburg. He never fully recovered from his 12 years in Soviet captivity. He worked various jobs after returning to Germany, but never found stable career. He married again in the 1960s, but the marriage failed partly because of his psychological problems stemming from captivity. He remained active in prisoner of war organizations and gave testimony to historians documenting captivity experiences. His final interview, recorded in 1985, included his reflection. "I survived Stalingrad and survived 12 years in Soviet camps, but I never really came home. Part of me is still there in those camps, still hungry, still cold, still wondering if tomorrow will be the day I die. The camps took my youth, took my health, took any chance of normal life. I don't hate the Russians. They suffered more than we did because of what Germany did to their country. But I wish someone would remember what happened to us, would acknowledge that we suffered too, would recognize that we were human beings, not just numbers or laborers. Most of my comrades died there. I survived, but I'm not sure surviving was better than dying. At least the dead found peace." His words capture the complexity of the prisoner's experiences and the lasting impact of years spent in captivity under harsh conditions.